All right, I'm gonna get started. So hello everyone, I'm Jaime. I work with Ines Montaño's group. And today I'm gonna be talking about simulating energy transfer in photosynthesis using quantum computations. And so photosynthesis is this complex process with multiple steps. And one of those first steps being light harvesting, which is what we focus on here. And how light harvesting works, it begins with this first step of energy being absorbed by a molecule, sort of like the one in this red box right here. And these molecules make up what is known as the light harvesting complex. And these light harvesting complexes really act as kind of antenna for these light harvesting systems. And so one thing that we really want to study about these systems is how does the energy get absorbed in one of these light harvesting complexes and travel to what is known as the reaction center, that blue circle in the figure off to the left. And the reason why I want to study this is because light harvesting is actually a very efficient process. And so ideally, you want to be able to model this process and have a better understanding of how it works. Hopefully, we can get to the point where we understand how it works so we can apply what we know to a artificial photosynthetic system as well, because in biology, it's very, very efficient. And so traditionally, the way this process works is it really starts off with a molecule beginning at some light harvesting complex in one of these green circles. And we know after a certain amount of time, it'll reach the reaction center. But we don't actually know how or why it gets there in the path that it takes. So that is a question kind of we are set out to kind of understand. And I mentioned that in the beginning of the title that it's a quantum talk. So where does quantum play into all of this? And that starts with this paper that came out in 2007, where this group led by Greg Engel has been able to kind of find these quantum-like characteristics happening within this energy transfer process. And from this, we're able to kind of get two big things out of it. The first thing being that we've been able to start studying these biological photosynthetic systems as quantum systems, and to kind of get a better understanding of how this kind of works in the quantum regime. Let's go back to the figure. And let's start with, let's say a photon is absorbed in one of these light harvesting, or one of the molecules within the light harvesting complex. And that would be our initial quantum state. And then over a certain amount of time, eventually the energy will be transferred into the reaction center. And when that happens, that would be sort of our final quantum state. And using this method, we can use the Schrodinger equation to model how the system would change, or these states would change over time. And so that's kind of the quantum description. The next thing that this paper was able to, what they claimed, is that there's this idea of this possible explanation for why this process happens so efficiently. And this kind of has brought up a lot of controversy in this area of study, because some people believe that these quantum effects are why the energy transfer happens at such an efficient rate, while others don't believe that at all. And so in this talk, I'm not trying to pick a side. I just want to be able to understand how to use quantum and these quantum computational techniques to study these systems. And to do so, and what most people do is you start off with the simplest case. One of the simplest cases being propylbacteria. Propylbacteria is one of the simplest cases for three reasons. The first reason being that it has this, the entire system has this sort of spherical shape to it. Secondly, it's only made up of three major components, two light harvesting complexes, and a reaction center. And lastly, the last thing, which is kind of evident in all three of these figures, is that these components, the molecules that make them up, are organized in this sort of geometrical shape, which in this case, it's just a circle. And most of the calculations are treating these systems as quantum systems have been done on using classical computers to perform these quantum computations. But why not use a quantum computer to perform these quantum calculations? This is something that was kind of hinted at by Richard Feynman in his paper on simulating physics. Why not use quantum to study quantum? And so last year, this group led by Jaime Diaz et al., they were able to study one of these systems using a quantum computer. And so what they did was they considered an isolated case of two molecules. We'll just say the blue molecule and the red molecule. And they were able to study and come out with a figure of showing the probability of being in one of these systems over a set amount of time. So if we look on the figure off to the top left, you can see these symbols, these triangles, these blue triangles represent the probability of being in that quantum state over a certain amount of time. And these red circles represent the probability of being in that other quantum state, or that red molecule, over a set amount of time. As you can see, over time, they have this oscillatory characteristic to it. And the oscillatory characteristic has to do with the fact that in this case, it's an isolated system, meaning there's no environmental factors playing a role into this. And we're only considering the energy kind of transferring between two molecules instead of an entire system. And the two big things that we were able to get out of this were, first, we were able to model this biological system on a quantum computer. And two, we were able to encode the information of these molecules onto a quantum bit, which is really exciting. And so you might be wondering, how do they do it? And it really comes down to using this equation up here. And what this equation really is just a solution to the Schrodinger equation. And using this, we can study how a quantum state can evolve over time. And one of the main ingredients in this equation, in this exponential, is this h sub s, which is just the Hamiltonian of the system. The Hamiltonian you can just think of as like an n-band matrix, where the values on the diagonal represent the energy eigenvalues of the system, and all the other values represent all the interactions that can happen within the system as well. And so in the paper, Jaime Diaz et al., they were able to simplify this Hamiltonian for their case of two molecules to this 2x2 matrix, where these two values represent the energy eigenvalues for each of the molecules, and the J values represent their interactions. And so using this Hamiltonian and the equation, they were able to construct a quantum circuit. And the reason why they wanted to construct a quantum circuit is so they can run this on a quantum computer. And so for those who aren't familiar with quantum circuits, the way you read them is left to right. So in this case, we're considering our initial case, which is just this orange box, where we have an initial qubit that is representative of our two molecules, and then an ancilla qubit. This ancilla qubit, for those who don't know what ancilla qubits are just qubits that are necessary to perform these computations. But we were mainly focused on that first qubit up top. And so we begin with this quantum state, and then we include this series of quantum logic gates, which come directly from the exponential equation with the Hamiltonian. And so applying these series of gates to our initial quantum system with the qubits, we are able to find how the state would change given a certain time. And so using this technique, they were able to produce a lot of results. The first one being sort of the initial figure that it showed, where they had this isolated case, but they were able to expand this into cases where they include this environmental factor. And what you can see from this figure up here is that as they include, in this case, they included a very large environmental factor into this system, there's this damping effect that happens, which makes a lot of sense, because over time you have less and less probability of being in one state or the other. And it's hard to dictate like what state you're going to be. But this was really a starting ground for a summer RU project that we are doing over the summer. And so over the summer, our goals with an RU student were to reproduce the results from this paper, and more importantly, learn the methods that they used to simulate how the system would evolve over time. And so in the paper, they really talk about wanting to answer the question of is photosynthesis quantum or is it not? But in this case, those aren't our intentions at all. We just want to be able to understand the techniques so that later on we can apply these to an artificial photosynthetic system, which I don't think I've mentioned before, but basically the idea is we want to be able to use the systems to use the system to understand if we understand how biological systems work, see if we can use like a biomimetic approach to apply them to artificial photosynthetic systems. And so the way we did it, there's kind of two projects happening over the summer. The first being we needed to generate the Hamiltonian. That was done with work from one of our students, Alexander Hardin. And so basically he wanted to try to figure out the Hamiltonian of this entire system. He was looking at this B850 ring of one of the light harvesting complexes within Probobacterium. And the reason why is because it's one of those main ingredients in that equation that I showed before. I was also able to produce this result, this image off to the right, which kind of shows the interactions between every single one of the molecules. And that's kind of where Alex is headed. And secondly, what the project that I was a little bit more involved with was the simulating of these energy transfer over a certain amount of time. And in this case, this was done with work from one of our RU students, Jaime Diaz. And we considered just an isolated case of interactions between just molecules within the B850 ring. So some of the results that we were able to come up with through a lot of hard work from Jeremy were so in this first case, we considered two neighboring molecules. And what we were able to show is that we first start off in this 100% probability of being in this first state. So in that blue state, first molecule. And then over time, as you can see, the probability of being in that state decreases. However, the probability of being in the other state increases. This is kind of analogous to the energy being in one of the molecules and then transferring to the other. And then we kind of have this oscillatory factor going on to play because of the fact that it's an isolated case. We're only considering two molecules in the system. We're also able to do simulations for other neighbors. So this is the third nearest neighbor. And one thing you'll kind of notice is that the time scale in which it takes for the energy to transfer is much longer. And we also did the furthest neighbor. And as you can see, again, the transfer time increases even more. And so we were able to produce some of the results from this paper, which is really good. But more importantly, we were able to kind of learn and understand the techniques that they utilized in this paper to perform this simulation. And so at this point, we kind of have many different pathways in which we can take. We can continue to study this simple case with the Probobacteria. We can also branch out into maybe other biological, maybe more complex systems. However, we can also branch out and start looking at artificial systems if we really wanted to. This is just, this figure off to the right here is AFM of polymeric chlorosome nanocomposite, which is one of our like artificial cases that we are considering. This figure is produced by Gabe. But there's also this third pathway that we want to consider. And this is the one that I'm a little more excited about. So in this other pathway, we really have to take a second look at the structure, right? And so if you really look at this image right here, and you look at how all of these molecules, which are represented by these little circles, interact with each other, and all these lines represent how they communicate with each other. Well, it kind of sort of looks like a network, right? So the thought, for those who don't know, we also work with the Center for Quantum Networking, where our ultimate goal is basically to create a quantum internet. Basically, it's just internet, but for quantum computers specifically. And what's really exciting is that because of our work with them, we have this different perspective on how to use these or view these models, these quantum systems, right? Which it would only really happen if someone who's studying these systems or this theory or this field or someone who studies this field would only have this perspective on looking at these systems that way. And so using what we know about these quantum networks and how we know that they're basically these quantum devices that are connected through these quantum channels, and they can be all connected together. Why not use the knowledge and understanding we have there and tools to model these biological systems that we had just discussed, right? Where in this case, we can consider these quantum devices would be analogous to the molecules in the system, and the quantum channels would be sort of the medium in which this energy travels through, and sort of like the environment. And so how would you do this? I would be doing it using a quantum network simulator. So the quantum network simulator that I am most familiar with is called NetSquid. It was created and designed by QTech over in the Netherlands. And it is one of the sort of state-of-the-art quantum network simulators currently. And what this NetSquid has to offer is that it has a wide range of tools to our disposal to model these quantum networks. And so there are kind of two big things that kind of come out of using a quantum network simulator. First being that we can, using this quantum network simulator, generate various different types of architectures, meaning that we're not limited to simple cases. We can branch out to more complex cases. So if we, transfer that over to, the photosynthesis realm, we're not limited to just studying this propylbacteria system, right? We can branch out into more complex systems and even more excitingly into artificial systems as well. And that is one of our big motivations and one thing that kind of really has me excited. And then the second thing, because it's a simulator, we have complete control. So we can manipulate these qubits, which would be sort of analogous to these molecules in the system. And we can also manipulate the environment or the quantum channel. And that is sort of where I'm at and where I'm planning on heading. Well, I'd really like to thank Jeremy and Alexander for all the hard work they did over the summer. They really got this project off its feet. I'd like to thank my advisor, Ines Montaño, for all her help, as well as Gabe for all the advice for this project that he's given. Thank you to my MIRA family for being here today. Thank you to NCI for funding the summer project. And lastly, thank you to CQN for the different perspective.
All right, a couple of minutes, but questions?
Okay.
First.
Regarding the quantum circuit that we had on slide 18 and 20, referred to as silk qubit. Can you explain why that's the first state and not like a zero state?
So that has to do directly with to perform the calculations and to get the system to look how it did. They could have used a zero state, but I believe it would have flipped the figure. So it would have flipped the image off to the left.
One more question, William.
What do you mean when we talk about the environmental factors? How does that work in quantum?
So in quantum computing, or so you mean how did they implement it into?
Like what are they? What is the environment?
Oh, so well, you can think of just any sort of environmental. So in the biology realm, it's just thermal fluctuations and whatnot. So that's basically what they're trying to encode into this quantum circuit, or that's how they just encoded that using sort of like this random fluctuation thing to kind of model this environmental factor. Yeah. Should be able to show. Oh, great.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jorge Munoz, and I've been using atomic force microscopy under Gabe Montaño and for the MIRA group. What you typically hear about with AFM is that they use a small cantilever with a sharp tip to produce topographical maps in the nanoscale. In addition to that, what you will learn here are other key aspects of AFM and how I use them in my research. In particular, or the goal of this talk is to present to you how the mechanics of nanostructure can be determined and used to investigate its effect on other physical properties of a material. In particular, I'm going to be talking to you about my characterization of some of the samples in one of the components of Dr. Sam Sarkar's dissertation. A little over a year ago, when it was still Mr. Sam Sarkar, Sam explained that his group was engineering chiral materials, and they used circular dichroism to investigate the chiro-optical properties of the material. Circular dichroism, or CD, is a measure of how a chiral material will absorb circularly polarized light. What I'm showing you here is right-handed circularly polarized light. Here is left-handed circularly polarized light, and the difference in absorption provides a measure of a CD. Sam explained that they were tuning the geometry of these helices so as to produce strong absorption in the ultraviolet. Now, these helices are made of titanium dioxide, a semiconductor material. And when I say strong CD, I mean stronger compared to the CD of chiral molecules. What was I going to say? Now, the tunable and strong CD of ultraviolet is novel in itself, but Sam wanted to take this a step further and study the interface effects that occur between a metal and a semiconductor that occur when he decorates the helices with gold. What I am showing you here is the CD spectra of the helices with various depositions of gold. And we see that the helices without gold produced the strongest absorption in the ultraviolet with black here. Now, the goal behind decorating the helices with gold was to produce strong tunable CD in the ultraviolet as well as in the visible wavelengths. When we look at the visible spectrum, we see that the titanium dioxide helices without the gold produce the 0 line. But even just a small 1 nanometer deposition of gold or a change of 1 nanometer deposition of gold produces strong CD in the visible wavelengths. Sam hypothesized that the change in CD was due to the interface effects between the titanium dioxide and the gold nanoparticles that were essentially should be forming at the top of these helices at this deposition. He also noted that as you continue adding larger depositions of gold that didn't really have much of an effect on the change of this effect, and that this wasn't much of an additive effect, if not synergistic, meaning that as you continue adding more gold, you see that the ultraviolet absorption begins to diminish. Sam then wanted to test this hypothesis, and that's where I come in. The principal question that I wanted to address was, can I use atomic force microscopy to resolve the gold ions on top of the helices? A secondary question I wanted to address was, can I then produce an analysis of the size distribution of these gold nanoparticles? As I began scanning these samples, I realized that there were some challenges right away. These surfaces were very rough, and the titanium dioxide and gold were very similar in bulk modules. I'm going to explain to you what I mean by these challenges, and you're going to understand how I overcame them. But is atomic force microscopy an appropriate characterization technique here? I am showing you some of the results from my experiments, but what I mean to tell you here is that AFM offers very high resolution in the vertical scale that transcends the few hundred nanometer resolution limit of optical microscopes. And in general, for scanning probe microscopy, the lateral resolution is determined by the shape of the tip. How good can we get it? We can get atomic resolution under the appropriate, very expensive conditions, but it turns out that for my experiments, atmospheric conditions are good enough. Additionally, AFM works very well with conductive and non-conductive samples. And AFM is typically cheaper than electron microscopy in both initial cost and general usage. I'm not trying to say that AFM is better. All I'm trying to say is that we have access to about 3 AFMs. I think we have access to one old SEM in Weta, and I don't know that we have any TEMs yet. Now, in my experiments, I collected 3 types of images. What I'm showing you here are the helices without the gold deposition. This is the surface profile. I also collected the amplitude images because of their high sensitivity to edge effects. I also collected phase images because I wanted to determine any change in material. I reproduced these experiments with the 3 nanometer deposition on the helices, the 18 nanometer deposition, as well as a 3 nanometer deposition of gold on just a silicon chip, a flat surface. I'm going to explain to you why I needed more than one type of imaging. I'm going to explain to you why I'm only showing you half of the data that I produced. And I'm going to show you essentially why it is that I use these 6 images to answer the questions that I started with. What I'm showing you here is a surface profile of the helices with the 3 nanometer deposition of gold. I chose this scale because it should be good enough to resolve the gold hemispheres, but also because I wanted to check to see that there was a uniform distribution on the sample surface. Now, what you could tell probably right away is that these don't look like helices at all. Now, what we're seeing here is a topographical map, in other words, a top view, a bird's eye view of this array of helices, okay? One of the challenges I mentioned earlier was that these surfaces were very rough. What do I mean by that? I want you to consider the diameter of the surface of the Earth, okay? Now, if we take this scale bar that I offer here, then compare it to the diameter of the surface of the Earth, diameter of the Earth, then basically the variations that I'm trying to detect are about the size of my fist, approximately. Okay, now if this were a flat surface, might be able to get away with just doing the height imaging and be done with it. However, the titanium dioxide provided an enormous variation in height. And so then I'm trying to detect these small variations, and it's just not going to be good enough to only do the height images. So how did I do these measurements? Well, along these lines, I took measurements at various points with a sharp tip, small cantilever. I dragged them in one direction to produce some measurements. I did it in reverse to produce another set of measurements. I repositioned the tip, and I iterated this process until I generated these images. This is called the raster scanning technique. I hope to show you here's a video. And what I'm showing you here is the force versus distance. And here is the amplitude of the oscillations. And you can see it diminishes as you introduce intermittent contact. But I want you to note that the amplitude remains relatively constant as the scanner traces the profile of the sample surface. This technique goes by various names. I'm going to be referring to it as a tapping mode. And it is the mode that I use to generate the data in all of my experiments. What I'm showing you here are the probe, cantilever, and tip. Earlier, when I said a sharp tip, I mean atomically sharp. Here are some SEM images of tips similar to the ones that I used in my experiments. So here's a list of agents that will cause the cantilever to deflect. And on the right, I'm showing you the natural behavior of the cantilever as you begin to approach the sample surface. I performed experiments in both the attractive and repulsive regimes exclusively. And it turned out that the repulsive regime produced the best results. And so those are the only ones that I'm showing you here. Now you can see that this principle of tapping atomic force microscopy is actually pretty straightforward. If you imagine just tapping your pen like a classical harmonic oscillator, and if you drive it at the appropriate frequency, then you can produce some standing waves like in one of the experiments that we teach here at NAU. And if you approach resonance conditions, then you can get maximum amplitude of these standing waves. Now, if you were to introduce intermittent contact with the sample surface, then we can monitor the amplitude using the photodetector. And then the controller, by introducing some tolerance, we can monitor essentially the change in amplitude and then apply a correction, whether the cantilever has to be raised or lowered according to what's measured there. When I said I wanted to use the phase images, it's because I wanted to detect variations in material. Okay. Now, if we start scanning from right to left on a flat surface like the one I'm showing you here, and the frequency is being held constant and there's no change in height, then the amplitude should remain essentially the same in magnitude. However, as the tip interrogates the hardness of a surface and then that hardness changes, well, we're going to start measuring our phase offsets in the input signal and the signal that we can measure using the photodiode. Here's a quick example of what that essentially looks like. What you see here are the two sinusoids of the input signal and the output signal, and they come into and out of phase. And I'd like you to note that the amplitude remains essentially the same, but as you scan through different hardnesses, you begin to see phase differences, and that's what you see at the bottom plot right here. It says Z, but it's phase offset with respect to position. The main takeaway here is that the variation of bulk moduli of these materials will cause measurable variations in the phase offset. One of the challenges I mentioned earlier was that the gold and the titanium dioxide were very similar in bulk modulus. So you can see that as a result of that, when you examine the phase image here on the left that has no gold, but the phase image on the right, which has the 18 nanometer deposition, they look essentially the same. Basically, what this means is that I couldn't use this information because there was no appropriate progression that would indicate any detection of some kind of these nanohemispheres. The amplitude images are what saved the day. The amplitude images here essentially correspond to changes in amplitude, okay? Now I chose to use them because they were very sensitive to edge effects, and I wanted to capitalize off that feature, and I'm going to explain to you a little more carefully what I mean by that. I would like you to imagine the sample surface I'm showing you here. And what I'm showing you at this plot is that the sample surface provided by the scanner is not really all that good. What we would expect to get is something like the sample profile. It's given right there. It should be higher in definition. We can see that the scanner is not good enough to do it on its own, which is why we have to look at the amplitude, oscillation amplitudes. And that's why we end up looking at the cantilever oscillation amplitudes. I'd like to draw your attention to this part right here, where you see that the scanner will begin to sense that there is a variation in height. However, the controller has no problem maintaining that amplitude constant during that variation. It's not until the tip encounters an abrupt change in the surface where the controller then has to scramble quickly to restore the amplitude oscillation. And that's, you can see right here. And the opposite happens as it steps off. Now, the information given in this plot is kind of messy. It's kind of a lot, which is why we look at the change, the cantilever oscillation amplitude, which is now very simple. You see that even though there's variations in height right here, that produces no signal, but then the edge effects are really what come out. And that is what I hope to capitalize off of here. So my results are the following. On the left, you see the titanium dioxide without the gold. On the right, you see the titanium dioxide with a 3 nanometer deposition of gold. And we can observe from the topography that these helices are essentially very similar in size when you compare the two. But when you start looking at the topography of the 3 nanometer deposition, we begin to see the formation of these nanostructures that start coming out. And this is supported by the amplitude images here that are sensitive to these edge effects. We also know that these features are congruent with the 3 nanometer deposition of gold in the flat silicon surface. Now, when we compare the 3 nanometer deposition on the helices to the 18 nanometer deposition on these helices, we see that those nanoscale features essentially get brushed off. They move away essentially, and we don't see them anymore in the 18 nanometer deposition. Okay, but the other key point that you need to notice here is that the helices on the 18 nanometer deposition, they look like they changed size, they look bigger. And what we attribute that is to this gold plating that occurs between neighboring helices. Okay, for those of you that are sitting further back than the third row, here's the titanium helices without the gold. Here's the 3 nanometer deposition of gold where you can start seeing these effects. Let me go backward. Without the gold, with the gold. These look blurry, and there's a reason for that, but I don't have time to go into it. And the take-home messages are the following. Yes, I can use AFM to resolve these gold islands on top of the helices, but I cannot provide an appropriate analysis of the size distribution here because of the variation due to the underlying titanium dioxide surface. It was so great, you see, that even if I were to go on ahead and produce these values, we wouldn't be able to rely on them because there would be such gross manipulation of the data that the statistical analysis would be useless, okay? But that doesn't really stop us from achieving the objective, which is to test Sam's hypothesis. And we see that with AFM, it supports the hypothesis, okay? Sam hypothesized that this change in CD was due to the electrons on the gold islands and the valence band that were excited to the conduction band, thereby changing the conductivity of the titanium dioxide, therefore changing its index of refraction and producing the change in circular dichroism. I'd like to point out, it took a lot of work to produce these images, and I'm very proud of them. I wish I had enough time to tell you how difficult they were. In fact, that might make for a very good question. But what I can tell you is I wouldn't have been able to produce these images without the support of my mentors. They were not only great sources of knowledge, but also examples of the type of mentorship that I want to achieve someday. Matt spent hours training me. Greg spent lots of time making sure that I don't mess up my data and my experiments. And my advisor, Gabriel Montaño, I'm a wildcat from the U of A, and he's a Sun Devil from ASU, but he still took me in and showed me the world of microscopy. And Gabe, I want you to know, I think you're an angel, and I don't care what everybody here says about you, right? ASU, I want you to know that. I also want to thank Drs. John Gibbs and Dr. Sam Sutler. Congratulations, Dr. Sam. My name is Jorge. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have 2 minutes for questions.
You said that you were not able to catalog the items on top of the gold or where these came from. Do you have any idea as to what technique you can do to do that? Or how
So the question here for the folks at home is, what could I do to catalog the gold islands on top of the helices? Well, I could go on ahead and apply the standard masking techniques. Now, it would work out very beautifully if it was just the gold and the surfaces were flat. We apply a masking technique that basically subtracts the features that are essentially artifacts, not a problem. If we expect the surface to be flat, like on mica or silicon, not a problem. However, there was so much variation due to the titanium dioxide substrate that if we were to apply those same techniques, we would essentially just rough it up entirely. In other words, perhaps we can use a different technique in conjunction with AFM to maybe produce a reliable analysis. But here it wasn't enough to just do the AFM. Even if I went through the trouble, shouldn't rely on those results at all. That answer your question? Thank you.
2 more minutes. Nico?
I was gonna ask how difficult it was to do.
Wonderful question. Outstanding. Thank you, Nico. How difficult was it to produce these images? I'm telling you right now, I was basically running these images for about 6 or 7 months. I just started learning AFM. I was starting to even just start those techniques. The experiments, that was rough in and of itself because there's so many factors that are involved in setting this up. And so you see, typically these AFM pictures are, when we use this characterization technique, typically those surfaces are flat, makes it really nice and easy. But these helices were really rough. And I was taking 40-minute scans, 40 minutes to take just one, and I thought that that was the right thing to do because it would get better resolution. No, it's not. Apparently, doing that caused the tip to stick and stuff. I got really pissed off one day and I said, screw it. I don't care if I break the damn thing off. I'm going to run them and make sure that these scans take 5 minutes. And all of a sudden I started seeing these things and I'm like, ho, 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 ho. But that didn't happen without a whole lot of trial and error. And now that I have that insight, I recognize that it's very difficult to kind of go from one sample to another. Kind of like Jen says, have to kind of have a taste to do this kind of business and experience. And yeah, to answer your question. Thank you. Maybe anybody at
I
home?
did see that someone raised their hand online, but I think since it's 4:40, I'm gonna push ahead. Sorry about that, John. Jake, I can get set up. Follow that out with the hat. Nonsense, you like it.
I have a flash drive too.
Are you on? You don't even need to plug in. If you're on the Zoom meeting,
Oh, yeah.
I'll make you a co-host and then
Yeah.
you can just share your screen. And I think you should be ready now. Yeah. Go. Perfect.
All right, hello everybody. I'm closing it out. My name is Jake, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about quantum network tomography. Maybe. And so to start off, I want to talk about quantum computers in general. So most of us have probably heard of quantum computers and the types of problems that they can supposedly solve. And there's a wide variety of applications that people propose for quantum computers, such as in cybersecurity, the pharmaceutical field, climate change, and a bunch more. But typically when we think of quantum computers, we think of this magical device that's really far away in the future and that eventually maybe we'll get one. And so with that, I would like to just respond with, this is a commercial quantum computer advertised by IBM called Quantum System 1. Quantum computers do exist to an extent. The catch is they're not as powerful enough to take on the types of problems that we want them to yet. But what I would like to get across here is that quantum computers aren't as far away as we think they are. They're not these mystical devices that maybe we'll get one day. They do exist and they do have some applications now. And because they are coming around quicker than we think, we need to start thinking about how we're going to connect these computers. And so we need to start thinking about how we're going to create quantum networks. And the reason that this is important, obviously, is because we want to develop things such as a quantum internet. And well, obviously, quantum internet as an analog to the classical internet would do wonders for us. But also, we want to think about the fact that if we were to connect a bunch of classical computers together to get a supercomputer, we might be able to achieve the similar effect with quantum computers. So maybe we don't have to generate better quantum computers if we can generate a good enough quantum network to sort of hook these together. And so it brings along the question, do we need a quantum network? I mean, we have classical networks, classical internet, do we need a quantum network? Quick answer, yes. Because it's a quantum network, it's going to take advantage of quantum mechanical properties, and the classical networks we have in place are not going to be able to hold up and actually keep the quantum effects within them. And so a couple of these that I want to talk about are quantum bits, referred to as qubits, and entanglement in general. And so I'm going to quickly jump into bits and qubits. And so generally when we think of a classical computer and we think of how it encodes information, we think of it as zeros and ones, right? We have these two discrete values, and this is how we encode all of our information on computers. For a quantum bit or a qubit, we still have zeros and ones, and you'll see that they look a little bit different. And that's because when we can also have superposition states that exist basically as in-between states. We're not limited to having a discrete 0 and a 1. We can have basically a combination, parts of zeros and parts of ones that we can put together. And this is part of what allows quantum computers to send more information and be considered better than a classical computer. And what I want to get across here is they don't, the reason I should point out, the reason these are spheres is because we're dealing with complex values here. So it's not going to be like a two-dimensional circle, but they don't have to be right in the middle. We can have certain amounts of 0 and 1, very specific superpositions put together to where when we measure it, we can see in this case, if it's pointing a little bit towards us and closer to the 0, we see that it might fall into the 0 more often than it falls into 1 when we measure it. But when we send these superposition states, we can send them as these very specific probabilities that can encode information. So we can see that this is a very different value than this one. And so even though they're both considered a superposition, we can send a lot more information this way. And so generally, what I want to get across is that a classical network is not going to be able to handle these types of superpositions in them. And so that's one of the reasons that we're going to need to have quantum networks do this. The other reason that I want to talk about is quantum entanglement. So qubits can be entangled, and essentially what this means is that if we take two qubits, we can have them interact in a way that allows their state to be related. And I know that sounds kind of vague, but it's this interesting process where they're sort of dependent on each other. We can create an entangled state where the measurement of one qubit can actually influence or depend on however you want to phrase it, the measurement of the other. And the cool thing about this is they're not physically connected in this way. We can actually separate them as far as we possibly can, and they will still be interconnected in some sense. And so this was referred to as Einstein's spooky action at a distance. And so what I want to show is that classically, if we wanted to make a copy of a bit, like a classical bit, like a 0 or a 1, we can do so. But in quantum, we cannot do this. And this is due to what's referred to as the no cloning theorem, which, as you could probably guess, we can't clone qubits. But one thing we can do to get around this is we can entangle qubits. And so basically what we can do here is we can start with, we want to send a 0. And when we send this 0, we can basically develop another 0, not a copy, but we can develop, and it doesn't have to be a 0, but we can develop another qubit in which we can entangle or basically perform processes on. You might recognize this quantum circuit based on what Jaime showed us earlier. It's not really as important to understand what it means here, aside from it is a process that we can use to entangle our qubits. We don't really have to worry about specifically what those gates are or what that circuit is. But think of it as there are processes we can use to entangle these qubits. And as you can hopefully see in the images here, when they're entangled, they're no longer both in a 0 state. In the way we've generated this entanglement, we see that we have these superposition state. And it looks similar to what we had on one of the previous slides where we have it could fall into a 0 and a 1, this in-between state. But there's 2 values here, and these 2 values correspond to these 2 different qubits. And what we'll notice is that if we were to perform a measurement and have it fall into this 0 state on either the first or the second, the other qubit has to fall into the same state. So if one qubit is measured as 0, the other will be measured as a 0 as well. And the same goes for the 1. And so this is how we can say that their states are they're entangled, but this is how they're sort of related. And this happens regardless of distance. So what we can essentially do is we can take one qubit and then we can entangle it with another qubit, send it to 2 different places, and then we can have their information be related so that we can get information from one place to 2 different places. And this is another process that a classical network isn't going to be able to handle. So again, we need quantum networks. I also want to mention that this isn't limited to 2 qubits. This is a specific example called a GHZ state. What's important here on this slide that I want to show, again, not the process, but the fact that we can take certain processes and say it doesn't have to be limited to 2 qubits. We can also entangle more than 2 qubits together. And it's very similar to the way we see it before, where we can see that depending on the measurement that we get, the other qubits are also going to fall into a related state. And so to go back to quantum networks, do we need them? Quick answer, yes. But then we need to think about, okay, so if we need a quantum network, what do we need to know once we have one, right? So we need to know how does it work? How do we want it to work? Because we have to set up, what if we need to have 2 qubits make it to a computer at the same time? Which one gets measured first? We need to answer certain questions about how it works. And then once we decide, okay, we have a setup that we like, we need to figure out, is it working the way that we think it's working? Because just because we've set it up and we go, it looks good, do we know that it's actually doing what it's supposed to? And then we want to know, how well is it working? Does it work 80% of the time? Is that even good enough if it works 80% of the time? We have to have ways to basically check to make sure that our network is working the way we want it and as well as it needs to. And so these are hard questions to ask when we don't really have them set up in the first place. And so a good place to start whenever we deal with things like this is we should go back to things we know. And so we want to look at, how are we going to be able to do this classically? Because we have classical networks and classical internet. So we should be able to look at how they manage to do this and try to implement it into quantum networks. And that's what brings us to network tomography. So classically, one of the methods of essentially gaining information about our networks is through network tomography. And what this means is essentially when we have a computer network and we want to send information from one point to another, it's not a straight shot from A to B. There's information on the inside. What we want to know with network tomography is, at our measurements on the outside, can we determine information about the inside? Can we find out specific information from here without ever actually measuring it, but only looking at the outside results from our network? And so I want to run through a quick example of how that works. So classically, right, we'll say that we want to send information from this first computer and it has to make it to these two computers. So if we wanted to send this 0 bit and we would send it to this node in the middle, we'll say this node has the capability to create copies of this 0 state. So it makes a second copy and then it distributes it to our two classical computers. No problems there. But then let's say we introduce a bit flip and we start seeing a bit flip about 50% of the time, or we see a bit flip on basically one of the qubits in the middle here. And so what happens is if our qubit is consistently, a classical bit here, if our bit is consistently flipping in one instance, so we'd run this, let's say 1,000 times, and we see that we sent a 0 and one is getting a 1 and one is getting a 0 every time, we can diagnose just from seeing our measurements that this specific channel is likely the one that has the issue on it because the other information is unchanged. But we never actually measured that this channel is having an error. We measured the results on the outside and we were able to determine where the error was on the inside based on these results. And the same thing can happen if we started seeing the error specifically on this bottom channel. We could make the assumption that based on our outside measurements that inside there is an error on this specific channel. And so we can try to apply this to quantum as well, quantum networks. And so in this case, I have it, it's the exact same setup. We just want to send information that makes it to two separate computers. And so we start with our 0 qubit, and I'm not going to show the circuits or gates this time, but we say we send it to the node, and the node is able to entangle it. So it's in this state that we saw earlier. And so because these two qubits are entangled, we can send them two different directions, and they will still share the same entangled state at the end. So this is basically what I already walked through before. Now let's say we implement the bit flip onto this system, right? Well, we're not going to see this result anymore. What we're going to see is we're either going to see I put two results there, and we're either going to see the top result or the bottom result. And you might notice right away that they look the same, which in itself would make it harder to diagnose, well, which one had the bit flip on it in the first place. But the more important thing that I'd like to point out here is that the entangled state, whether it be represented by this top one or this bottom one, it affects both pieces of information that have made it to two separate locations. So we can see classically when we have an error specifically on this bottom channel, our top bit is unaffected. We don't have an error up here. We don't see any errors up here. However, if we have an error on just one of these quantum channels here, we're going to affect the entire entangled state. So any qubits that are entangled there, we're going to see these types of errors regardless of what our output is. And so basically what I want to present here is that we can use the classical network tomography ideas, but we're going to have to apply them a little differently to get more information out. And so we can see this a lot, like we can see the problem a lot more if we look at a large scale example. So say I want to send information from the filled in circle to the outlines of the circles here. So I want to send one piece of information and have all of these interconnected. Let's say we have an error on this specific path and we run this a bunch of times. What we're going to find is that this path is experiencing an error, but the rest aren't. And so if we did our network tomography based on the outside measurements specifically, we could determine that there's an error associated with the path to that specific device. If we use the same exact example and say we want to connect all these computers using a quantum network, what we find is that we are going to see the result of this error exhibited in the state, the entangled state that is shared across every single device here. That doesn't necessarily mean that the information that these computers get is wrong, but it means that the state of all of these are going to be affected, whereas in the previous example, they're not. And so we have to sort of think about this as we go about trying to perform network tomography. So how are we going to be able to look at all of these states, see that they all are affected, and say the error came from here? These are the types of questions we have to figure out. And so some of the challenges with this really quickly is that quantum states in general are fragile and they produce a lot of errors. They require more repeater nodes and essentially they will have quantum specific errors as well as the type of errors we see classically. They can also be entangled, which can lend themselves to, as we've just seen, we can see the state change everywhere everywhere that qubits are entangled. Quantum networks are also in the first stage of development. So we can't just go to any lab and say, okay, we have a theory, we should run this. We need to make sure that we can pick out which theories we can send to these testbed labs that have very limited time and resources. And we have to be able to, without just guessing and testing, we have to have some sort of insight when we want to feed them information from theory. And the big problem, another giant problem that we face is we can't see inside the system. We can't make a measurement inside of our quantum system and still have everything go across, because when we make this measurement, it will affect everything due to quantum in general. And so these are a lot of different challenges. And so how are we actually going to even be able to produce the quantum network tomography data at all? And the solution that we're looking for here would be through simulators. And so specifically quantum network simulators. The great thing about them is they already exist. Jaime was talking about one, but I've listed a few of them here. We have NetSquid, Sequence, and QNetSim, but they already exist. And essentially these were developed to simulate how quantum networks would result, how we expect them to work. But what we want to use them to do is we basically want to use them to set specific errors inside our system and see what that does to our outside information. And can we track that if we put specific errors in, it will always result in specific outputs? And then can we reverse those outputs so that if we look at any system and we look at the outputs, can we tell what's happening on the inside based on the outputs that we get? Can we perform the quantum network tomography that we want to? And so the one that I'm going to be focusing on, the simulator, I should say, that I'm going to be focusing on is called Sequence, and it's a Python package that is completely open source on GitHub. And so I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but Sequence basically works off of different modules here. And I'm going to show it with the example that I set out to simulate. So in this example, essentially what I want to do is I want to create 3 entangled qubits and distribute 2 of those qubits to our 2 quantum computers, or quantum computer 2 and quantum computer 3. And so in order to do this, what Sequence is going to do, the way that we have to set it up, is each of these nodes is going to deal with these modules here. And so we have to send an application basically saying, I want to send my 3 qubits. I want to send 2 of them all the way from here to here. This application is going to go in, and each of these nodes has a network manager that communicates with each other to make sure that everything's on the same page. The network manager is also going to go to the resource manager for the first step and say, hey, we need 3 qubits to make this work. So if the resource manager says we have 3 qubits, it will generate the 3 that we can use. And then it's going to say, if we want to send them, we have to entangle them. There's different methods for entanglement. So we have to have an entanglement manager that says, okay, we need to make this work. And so the entanglement manager, if it can, is going to entangle them. And then basically from here, the network manager is going to make sure that the node we want to send it to has the spaces it can go to. And then the hardware, we can essentially simulate the hardware that we would see in an experimental lab. And so if I want to, I can say that the quantum channels we use and the entanglement generation that we use always works perfectly 100% of the time. But I can also implement my errors if I want to. In this case, it works perfectly. So we want to send these 2 across. The network managers make sure that there's space to have them. Then we want to send the 2 off in 2 different directions, and the network managers will communicate again, and the simulated hardware will fire them across, and it will work the way we expect it to. And so the idea here is that I can simulate how this network works without actually having to go to one, but I also have control over the error or lack thereof within the system. And I can take peeks at the inside of my system that I couldn't do in a real network. And so very quickly, I don't have a lot of results to show, but very quickly, if I were to do this previous method, it would be the 3 entangled qubits like we saw earlier. And so what we would expect is that if they're entangled, if we measure a 0 on one, then we should measure a 0 on all of them. Same goes for a 1. If we measure a 1 on one, we should see it on all of them. And the way the computer is going to represent these is going to represent the 0 as such and the 1 as follows. And so what I did is I spent a bunch of time trying to set this up, and basically I had it run 100 times. And what we see is that we are getting the exact same thing each time. And this is because I've set it so that our system runs perfectly with no errors in it. And so the logical next step would then be to start implementing errors into the system and start seeing what that does to our results. Unfortunately, I am not at this point yet. This is very recently that I got this to run. But we have had results on a similar system Jaime helped produce using NetSquid as opposed to Sequence. But I don't have results for this specific system yet. And so obviously our next steps, the first thing, start implementing these errors, start chugging and getting data out. And then once we start getting this data out, can we use it and determine what happens? Can we figure out based on this outside information, what's going on the inside? Then we want to start trying to apply different types of errors, like different types of quantum errors, like we could add just errors in general, such as loss, or we could add quantum errors where maybe our specific superposition starts to drift on us. So we can apply different types of errors and see, can we also characterize these with our models? Then we want to start applying more than one error at a time. Can we still determine what's happening on the outside with our numbers if we start adding more complex systems? So we can scale it up, add more errors, more types of errors. And the big question at the end of it is, do our models hold up? Can we actually produce data where we can look at the outside of our system and actually diagnose what's going on inside our system? And so that's what I'll be working on moving forwards. I'd like to acknowledge Jaime for helping doing a lot of the beginning steps on this and simulating his own on NetSquid. I'd also like to thank Mateus and his advisor, Don, who are from UMass Amherst. They are doing a lot of the theories that we want, or the entanglement theories and routing protocols that we would like to establish in the simulator. And we communicate with them through CQM. And I'd of course like to thank my advisor, Dr. Inés Montano, for literally all the help she's ever given me. And with that, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I'm going to go to John just because he threw his hand up last time.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hey, Jake. So this really good talk, by the way. I understood these qubits and quantum networks a little bit more, and it's got me wanting to regret my Black Friday buy of a new computer because I want these quantum computers now. But these quantum networks that you talk about, I know you like sort of compare them to like the normal computers that we have commercially, to where if you connect a bunch of good expensive computers, you're gonna get a nice supercomputer. So comparing that to these quantum like networks, to where like if we're sending data from one quantum computer to another quantum computer, I'm sort of picturing it as where we're sort of like creating a faster network in between these different computers. But as far as this network, would this like be like used as like, as far as like, are all these computers would be working together as under one like specific job or program or like specific task? And so finding these errors, as you said, as far as using these simulations, they're not necessarily for, they're basically an error reader for a large like super quantum computer, or is it like a bunch of different quantum computers working to just communicating but not really working together on the same sort of task? You get what I mean?
Yeah. And yeah, I was a little fuzzy on that, but kind of at the point that we're at right now, we could take it honestly either or both directions. So we're not locked into one or the other because we really haven't started trying to implement this yet. But the way that I understand it is, yeah, we could take it and we could have, if we link enough of them together and we're able to have to combine the computing power of it, that should work. But we also want to have it work basically the way that classical computers are, so where we can just connect two computers together in general. But I think we can go either way with it, if that answers your question.
No, yeah, exactly what you're saying. Yeah, because exactly, if a regular commercial computer, if we hook two towers up together, it's gonna have way more power compared to one tower. So and that 2-tower supercomputer now is gonna be running programs faster, and that's one program. So that's just my thinking. Like, so if we're connecting a bunch of quantum computers together, can we get this cybersecurity better compared to a quantum network of them, where one quantum computer is controlling one cyber security space and another quantum computer is controlling a different aspect of it, where they're not really, that whole thing is very cool. Thank you, Jake.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I want to follow right up on that. So if you do have them working on the same thing, Can you remind me what the current record is for qubits for quantity?
Yeah, so the current record, I don't remember off the top of my head. I know the one that I showed can handle, I believe it was 20 qubits.
Okay.
And I think they're trying to shoot for, I believe the number is 50, but I could be wrong on that.
So if you have two 20-qubit quantum computers hooked up on a network, assuming that the error rates are low enough for them to work together on the same application, how does it scale in combination of the qubits?
That's a good question. And I'm going to have to say, I'll get back to you on that because I don't really know. I am not very experienced in that in general. I just know that this is a potential thing that we can do with it.
Is it perhaps more than 20 plus 40 based on some of the metrics?
I'm honestly not too sure, but that is a good question.
2 minutes over. Sorry, I'll give you one last question.
You mentioned an example, hypothetical example where the quantum networks were say 80% efficient. So earlier on, so how would you go about determining that, and how would you go about improving that efficiency?
That is exactly what we're looking to find out. That's the kind of information that we're trying to find. Is we don't. That's a very valid question, and that's the thing. We don't really know. And so what we want to try and do is we want to try and see what can we do if we say that this channel specifically is always going to do a perfect bit flip, and then we get results at different numbers that we can get out of it from specifically the outside. Can we then reverse engineer it so that anytime we see certain amounts of data or certain types of data, can we look and say, okay, so this is working this number, that's this amount, this percent of the time, and then say the error is likely due to something in this area, this kind of error, this location, that kind of thing. So we don't know yet, but that's what we're hoping to find. Thanks.